The first thing anyone remembers is the smell, burnt hair and wet ash, something coppery hanging in the cold air like a bad thought you can't shake. The cabin door was already half off its hinges when the screaming started. Not loud, not frantic, but thin and animal, the kind of sound that crawls under your skin because it doesn't ask for help, it just exists. Inside, the fire had eaten through old boards and family heirlooms alike, blistering photographs until faces melted into one another, bones cracked in the heat, not skeletons yet, still human, still wrong. Someone outside crossed themselves, someone else spat into the dirt, no one stepped forward. Stories like this don't begin at the beginning. They begin in the middle, when something has already gone too far to undo. When a child is born knowing no names for things, only sounds. When a family tree bends inward until it snaps. When a place becomes known not by its name on a map, but by what people refuse to say about it. After the screaming faded, there was only the fire, and beyond it, the woods, endless, watching, patient. The Ozarks have always been good at keeping secrets. Their hills fold in on themselves, valleys swallowing roads, trails vanishing into brush so thick it feels deliberate. Cabins rot quietly out there. People do too. Generations can pass without leaving more than a mark in the dirt and a rumor carried by mouths that lower their voices without realizing why. Before anything else is said, before the ashes cool or the whispers harden into stories, there is a pause, a breath, a moment where you realize you're already inside it. So let me ask you something, softly. Which city are you listening from, and what time is it right now? Some places hear these stories better after dark, long before the fire, long before anyone thought to look too closely. The land itself was already closing in. Old county maps from the late 19th century show a nameless hollow, barely sketched, as if the surveyor's hand hesitated. Census records list a family there, then list them again, unchanged, decade after decade. Same surnames, same head counts, birth dates that overlap in uncomfortable ways. Church registries go silent after a point, pages torn or never filled. What isn't written down matters as much as what is. The cabin stood where the dirt road gave up. No marker, no mailbox, just trees pressing close, roots breaking through the floorboards like fingers searching for warmth. Neighbors, few as they were, learned early not to wander that far. Dogs wouldn't go near it. Children were warned away with stories that didn't sound like stories at all, just facts spoken too plainly. There's something wrong down there. Don't ask what kind. Inside that hollow, life folded inward. Birth followed birth, names repeated, roles blurred. A child arrived one winter who did not cry the way infants should. They say the mother didn't speak either, only rocked back and forth, humming something older than words. No doctor came, no record was made. The woods closed back in, and whatever was born there stayed. That child would grow, but not forward, not the way children elsewhere do. And as the years pressed on, the hollow pressed back, shaping flesh and thought and silence itself. What began as isolation hardened into inheritance. What was whispered became embodied. The fire would come much later, the screaming too, but the rot had already set in deep in the roots, waiting. Old men in nearby towns remembered the hollow before they remembered the family. They spoke of it the way you speak of bad weather, something that simply exists and alters your plans. The road there was never paved. County funds ran out before it reached the trees, and no one complained. What waited beyond the last gravel bend was considered settled business, finished long ago, the kind of place progress learned to step around. In the early records, the land changed hands only once. A deed filed, a signature barely legible, then nothing. The same name appears again and again in tax rolls, often marked delinquent, often forgiven. It was easier to let it slide than to ask questions. During the Depression, families elsewhere packed up and left. This one did not. During the war years, when young men vanished into uniforms and telegrams, none were taken from that hollow. Either no one was eligible, or no one came to check. Time behaved differently there. Seasons came and went, but history stalled. While radios crackled to life in town, and electricity crept along poles like a slow promise, the cabins stayed dark. Kerosene lamps, wood smoke, the rhythm of daylight. Children born into that rhythm never learned there was another one. The outside world became a rumor carried on the wind, not something meant for them. The child from the winter birth grew up watched but not taught. There was no school bell, no alphabet traced on paper. Language arrived in fragments, broken sounds traded between family members who understood each other without explanation. Outsiders would later mistake this for ignorance. It was something more closed than that. A dialect built entirely from within, sealed off from correction or expansion. As the child learned to walk, they learned the boundaries of the hollow, how far the creek ran before it turned rocky, which trees could be climbed, and which would cut your hands. They learned not to go toward the road. That lesson came without words, enforced by a tension that lived in the adults' bodies. The outside was not forbidden, because it was immoral or dangerous in a defined way. It was forbidden because it was unknown, and the unknown, to people shaped by isolation, is a kind of death. Neighbors caught glimpses over the years, a small figure standing too still at the tree line, eyes reflecting light without curiosity, movements that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. Whispers began, not loud enough to travel far. There's something off about that kid. Doesn't talk right, doesn't look right. The words carried judgment, but also fear. Difference has always unsettled communities that survive by sameness. Inside the cabin, roles blurred as the child aged. Adults were not guides so much as fixtures, like furniture worn smooth by use. Affection existed, but it was practical. Food passed hand to hand, warmth shared. There were no stories told at night, no explanations of who anyone was in relation to anyone else. Those distinctions had eroded generations ago. Mother, sister, aunt. The words mattered less than proximity. By the time the child reached an age where curiosity should have pushed outward, it turned inward instead. They began to watch the adults the way adults watch children, with an intensity that felt misplaced. They mimicked gestures, sounds, habits, collapsing the distance between generations. Identity in that hollow was not inherited so much as absorbed, and beneath it all, unspoken but ever present, was the truth the land itself seemed to know. Blood had been folding back on itself for a long time. The hollow remembered even if the people did not, and it was only a matter of time before that memory surfaced in ways no one could ignore. By the time the child reached their 10th winter, the hollow had begun to change its behavior. Sounds traveled differently. Night noises lingered longer than they should, echoing against the trees as if the woods were listening back. Dogs in nearby valleys started howling at nothing, long aching cries that carried uphill and then cut off all at once. People noticed. They always do, they just don't always speak. The child was rarely seen alone anymore. An older figure, stooped and watchful, followed at a distance, not a guardian in the ordinary sense, more like a tether. When the child stopped, the figure stopped. When the child turned, the figure turned too late, as if reacting rather than leading. The dynamic unsettled those few who witnessed it. Children are meant to be guided. This one seemed to be pulling something behind it. Inside the cabin, walls filled with marks, not drawings in the way schoolchildren make them, but scratches and symbols pressed into soft wood with nails or bits of wire. Circles inside circles, lines that doubled back on themselves. Figures with too many limbs, their faces erased or overwritten again and again until the surface splintered. No one could say when it started, only that it spread, creeping from the corners toward the center of the room like a slow infestation. The family did not stop it. They barely acknowledged it. In a place where boundaries had already dissolved, this felt like a continuation rather than an intrusion. The child made sounds while working, low and rhythmic, almost soothing. The adults responded with nods, grunts of approval. Whatever language had once existed between generations had collapsed into ritual. At night there were screams. Not every night, not even often enough to predict, just enough to ensure no one slept easily. They rose suddenly, sharp and brief, cut off as if a hand had been clamped over a mouth. Some said it was animals. Foxes can sound like children when they're dying. Others weren't convinced. The screams had shape. They carried intention. A preacher from a nearby town drove out once, convinced by his own righteousness that whatever lived in that hollow needed saving. He came back pale and shaking, refused to say what he'd seen. He never returned. At Sunday service he preached about bloodlines and original sin, about rot passed from father to son. His congregation listened in silence, already thinking of the place he would not name. The child's behavior grew stranger with time. They spoke less but understood more. Questions directed at them were met with long stares that felt evaluative, as if the roles had reversed and it was the child measuring the adult. They developed a habit of touching faces, tracing cheekbones and jaws with blunt fingers, lingering too long. The gesture made people recoil. It felt like being examined for flaws. Dead animals began appearing near the tree line, squirrels laid out carefully, birds arranged in uneven rows. Not mutilated, just sorted, patterns emerging where none should be. No blood spilled, no mess. The child would watch from the shadows while adults from nearby farms muttered prayers under their breath and hurried past. What frightened people most was not cruelty, but intention without explanation. There was no tantrum, no rage, no pleasure taken in these acts, just focus, purpose, as if something older than the child was moving through them, using small hands to rehearse. By then, the whispers had reached a pitch where silence itself felt dangerous. People began to look at one another differently, counting relations, remembering old marriages. The hollow was no longer just a place, it was a warning. And the child at its center was growing, carrying with them a truth that would soon force its way into the open, whether anyone was ready or not. The truth did not arrive all at once. It never does. It surfaced in fragments, like bone pushing through skin. A remark made too casually. A name repeated where it should not have been. A birth date. That overlapped another by weeks instead of years. In the county clerk's office, a woman sorting through old files noticed the same surname looping back on itself. Marriages recorded between people whose parents shared the same parents. Lines crossing, then crossing again, until the page looked less like a record and more like a knot. Those who knew how to read such things felt a cold recognition settle in. This was not a single mistake. It was a pattern. Brothers listed as husbands, sisters listed as mothers, children born without clear fathers because the category itself had lost meaning. The family tree did not branch. It collapsed inward, generation after generation, until there was nowhere left to go. In the hollow, no one spoke of incest. The word had no place there. Relationships were defined by proximity and repetition, not by taboo. When the child's parentage was quietly examined by those outside the family, the conclusion was unavoidable. The woman who bore them was also their aunt, possibly more. The man who slept in the next room was both father and uncle, his own sister's son. The roles folded in on themselves until they became interchangeable. This was the secret people sensed long before they understood it. It explained the faces that seemed unfinished, the language that never fully formed, the way identity itself appeared blurred. The child was not an anomaly. They were the inevitable result of a system that had been feeding on itself for decades. When word began to spread beyond the whisper network, fear hardened into something sharper. The church convened meetings behind closed doors. Elders spoke of shame not as a moral failing, but as a contagion, something that could spread, if not contained. They debated intervention, but no one wanted their name attached to whatever would follow. A night came when men gathered without formal agreement. They carried lanterns and tools meant for work, not violence, but the intent shifted as they moved. The dogs heard them first. Barking rolled through the hollow, frantic and disorganized. Lights flickered in the cabin. The child was seen at the window, face pale, expression unreadable. What happened next was later described as necessary, as mercy, as prevention. The animals were driven off or killed. Papers taken from the cabin were burned on the spot, records erased before they could travel further. Someone set the first flame, whether by accident or design. No one ever agreed. The fire climbed fast, fed by dry wood and years of neglect. Inside, the family scattered or froze. Some ran, some did not understand what was happening at all. The screaming started then, thin and terrible, the sound that would linger in memory long after the smoke cleared. The child was pulled free by someone whose face they never saw, dragged into the dark, hidden. By morning, the cabin was a blackened shell. The hollow smelled of ash and wet earth. People returned to their homes and did not speak of it again. Officially, the family moved on. Records listed them as relocated, deceased, or simply gone. The land was left to rot, but secrets like that do not stay buried. They settle into the soil, they wait. And decades later, when someone would come looking with fresh eyes and modern tools, the hollow would begin to speak again, through what little it had left behind. Time smoothed the scars on the land, but it did not erase them. Grass crept over the blackened earth where the cabin had stood. Trees leaned inward, reclaiming the space with quiet insistence. To anyone passing through years later, the hollow looked empty, unremarkable. That was the lie people told themselves. Absence can be louder than presence if you know what you're standing on. The child did not vanish with the fire. Air taken in by a distant branch of the family, one that lived closer to the road, closer to town, but still far enough removed to keep questions at bay. On paper, the child became someone else. A niece, a ward, a name adjusted just enough to pass. No one pressed too hard. Everyone involved understood the value of silence. Growing up away from the hollow did not unmake what had already been shaped. The child, now a teenager, struggled to adapt to the thin veneer of normalcy. School was attempted and abandoned. Classrooms were too loud, too crowded with rules that assumed a shared understanding the child did not have. Words were still difficult. Authority felt arbitrary. Touch remained a language they used without realizing it frightened people. They aged physically, but something in them stayed out of alignment. They watched others the way one studies a foreign ritual, mimicking gestures without grasping meaning. Relationships were confusing, boundaries incomprehensible. When asked about their parents, they offered answers that shifted with the question, each one technically true and deeply misleading. Meanwhile, the town pretended the hollow had never existed. New families moved in, old ones passed on. The fire became a footnote, then a rumor, then a story told only when someone insisted on knowing why that stretch of land remained undeveloped. The answer was always practical: poor soil, bad access. No one mentioned blood. In the late 1980s, a researcher arrived with no local ties and too much patience. She was a genealogist by training, drawn to patterns others overlooked. Her interest began with a cluster of incomplete records, anomalies that didn't fit the usual chaos of rural documentation. Names repeated too often, births recorded without corresponding deaths, marriages that connected families already connected. She followed the paper trail backward, then Ideways, church registries, land deeds, marginal notes scribbled by long-dead clerks. The further she went, the more the lines converged. What should have been a web became a knot. When she reached the hollow on an old map, something clicked. The absence wasn't accidental, it was curated. Locals were unhelpful in the way only people guarding a secret can be, polite, vague, forgetful on command. But one old woman, tired and close to the end, broke. She spoke of a child pulled from a burning cabin, of men who did what they thought was right, of a family that had folded in on itself until it could no longer tell where one person ended and another began. The researcher left with copies, photographs, and a growing sense of unease. DNA testing was in its infancy, but even the crude tools available confirmed what the records suggested. Extreme consanguinity, generations of it. The child, now an adult living quietly on the edge of town, was a living echo of that collapse. The question was no longer whether the story was true. It was what to do with it. Exposure meant harm. Silence meant complicity. The researcher understood that whatever choice she made, the hollow would claim its due. Some truths, once unearthed, refused to stay academic. The researcher waited before publishing anything. Months stretched into years. She told herself she was being careful, ethical. In truth, she was afraid. Every time she spread the documents across her desk, the same feeling crept in. Not curiosity, not horror. Responsibility. Once named, the story would belong to everyone, and everyone would take from it what they wanted. She visited the adult survivor once. Just once. They lived in a small house near the edge of town, close enough to hear traffic at night, far enough that no one stopped by without reason. The meeting was brief. Words failed early. Silence filled the gaps. The survivor watched her with that same evaluative stare people remembered from childhood, as if measuring whether this stranger was a threat or simply another passing shape. On the wall behind them hung a drawing. Circles inside circles, lines folding back into themselves, the same shapes once carved into the cabin walls, now rendered in pencil with careful precision. The researcher felt something tighten in her chest. The hollow had never let go. When she asked about family, the survivor shrugged. When she asked about parents, the answer came out fractured. Too many roles, too many truths stacked on top of one another. Mother was sister, father was uncle, names overlapped. The words did not carry shame, only fact. This was the world they had inherited. Leaving that house, the researcher understood the fire differently. It had not been about cleansing or justice, it had been about erasure, about burning a problem until it became smoke, hoping it would disperse before settling elsewhere. But blood does not evaporate. It carries memory in ways land and paper cannot. When the story finally emerged in fragments, it did so cautiously, an academic paper here, a local article there, each stripped of names, softened at the edges. Still, people recognized themselves in it. The town reacted with a familiar reflex: denial, anger, justification. We did what we had to do. It was a different time. You don't understand what it was like. Outside audiences were less forgiving. They saw only the horror, the spectacle of a family turned inward until biology itself rebelled. Some demanded accountability. Others consumed it as entertainment, shuddering safely from a distance. Very few asked about the survivor, about what it meant to live on carrying a lineage no one wanted to claim. The researcher received letters. Some thanked her, some accused her of exploitation. One warned her to stop digging. She archived everything anyway: tapes, photos, family trees that looked more like closed fists than branches. She knew that, even if she stopped, someone else would eventually pick it up. Secrets this dense exert gravity. The survivor continued living quietly, aging into a body that carried both resilience and fragility. They never married, never had children. Whether by choice or circumstance, the line ended there. The knot tightened one last time, then held. And yet, the story did not end with them. It lingered in the way people spoke about the hollow, in the way land was avoided, in the way certain questions still made conversations go silent. The fire had destroyed a cabin, not the legacy. That remained, woven into memory and bone, waiting for anyone willing to look too closely. Years after the researcher closed her files for the last time, the hollow remained untouched. No one built there, no one farmed it. Deer passed through, birds nested, leaves fell and rotted into the soil that had already absorbed so much. To the untrained eye, it was just another quiet pocket of forest. To those who knew, it was a grave without markers. The survivor died quietly. No fire, no crowd, just a hospital room that smelled of antiseptic instead of smoke. The body carried its history to the end, bones shaped by repetition, a face that bore the soft, unfinished lines of a lineage that had nowhere left to go. There were no children to stand at the bedside, no spouse to sign the forms. The nurse wrote a name on the chart that had already been revised too many times. Afterward, the town exhaled. Not in relief exactly, but in release. A tension they had carried for decades loosened. The last living reminder was gone. People told themselves the story was finally over, that whatever had gone wrong had burned itself out. But legacies do not require living witnesses. They persist questions that refuse to die. In records that surface when someone has the patience to look. In the uncomfortable realization that this was not a curse delivered from outside, but something built slowly, deliberately, through neglect and fear. The researcher, now old herself, was asked once what haunted her most about the case. She did not mention the incest, the deformities, or the fire. She spoke instead of the ease with which everyone had agreed to look away, how isolation became an excuse, how poverty became a justification, how a child could be born into a closed system and never be given the tools to leave it. There were no villains in the way people like to imagine them. No singular monster. Only a chain of small decisions, each one understandable on its own, catastrophic in accumulation. A family choosing familiarity over risk. A community choosing silence over intervention. Authorities choosing convenience over responsibility. Generation after generation, the cost compounded. The hollow stands as it always has, absorbing rain, roots, and memory. If you walk there at dusk, the air feels heavier. Not because something waits to harm you, but because something was abandoned there. A responsibility left unclaimed. A warning left unheeded. And that is where the story settles. Not in the spectacle of what that family became, but in the question it leaves behind. What would you do if you discovered your mother was also your sister? If your father's name looped back into itself until it lost meaning? Would you burn the evidence and walk away? Or would you sit with the truth, no matter how much it asked of you? The woods do not answer. They never have. They only remember. Long after the names faded from memory, the hollow continued its quiet work. Rain pressed stories deeper into the ground. Roots wrapped themselves around what little remained, claiming it wit. Haut judgment. Nature did not recoil from what had happened there. It simply incorporated it. Occasionally, someone new would wander too close. A surveyor, a hiker, a child chasing a sound they couldn't explain. They would feel it then, the unspoken weight, the sense that the land was crowded with things no longer visible. Most would leave without knowing why. A few would ask questions. Those questions rarely found answers. The truth is, the horror was never confined to one family or one place. It lived in the spaces where responsibility failed to arrive, where intervention was postponed until it felt impolite, where silence was mistaken for peace. The hollow was only the final shape those choices took. And so the story does not ask to be remembered for its shock, but for its warning. That isolation can rot into something unrecognizable. That secrecy, when protected long enough, begins to breed its own logic. That evil does not always announce itself. It often whispers, waits, and becomes routine. Nothing rises from the ashes there. No ghosts walk the trees. No curse lingers in the air. What remains is far quieter and far more dangerous, the knowledge that this happened not because people were cruel, but because they were willing to look away. The hollow keeps its silence. The rest is up to us.